Good morning, folks. Glad that you're joining us. We're gonna wait a couple more minutes, maybe 3 minutes or so, to get others, to let others join us as well, and then we'll start at 8:01. Again, good morning, folks. If you're just joining us, we'll start at 8:01, so we'll give others just a few more minutes to also join. Good morning, folks. We're gonna start in just about 1 minute. All right, I think we are going to start. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's morning scoop. We're talking about the general election and our preparations for the November election. We've seen record number of Arizonans voting in the August primary, and many expect that we'll also have a record turnout in November. So there's a lot to talk about. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. And of course, the Arizona Capital Times covers state government and politics. I want to thank our sponsor this morning for engaging with us this way. Secure Democracy is a nonpartisan organization that works to educate policymakers and the public about secure and fair elections. With the COVID-19 pandemic weighing heavily on Americans, Secure Democracy is focused on ensuring that voters have options to cast their ballots safely by pushing for increased access to absentee voting, expanded early voting location and hours, and maintaining adequate and safe in-person polling locations. And again, thank you, Secure Democracy, for sponsoring tonight, this morning's morning scoop. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us is Luis Rodriguez, who is the Associate Director of State Affairs for Secure Democracy, where he heads up the organization's work with state legislatures and local officials in 7 states. That includes, they include Arizona. Luis has extensive experience in state government affairs. He previously served as Director of Government Relations for the American Society Cancer Action Network in Oregon. Also joining us is Dr. Leanne Kelly. Dr. Kelly is the president of the Maricopa County Medical Society, whose mission is to promote excellence in the quality of care and the health of communities. Dr. Kelly is a board-certified psychiatrist who began her clinical trials research career at the University of Missouri Columbia School of Medicine, where she was also on the academic faculty from 1993 until 1998. After serving as a staff psychiatrist at Mayo Clinic in Arizona, she started her own private practice in 2006. She pioneered transcranial magnetic stimulation in Arizona using the NeuroStar device. She has been treating patients with TMS longer than any other psychiatrist in the state. Dr. Kelly, thank you for joining us. Luis, thank you for joining us. And
Happy to be here.
And finally, also joining us is Scott Jarrett, who is the Maricopa County Director of Election Day and Emergency Voting. Scott previously served as Audit Manager of Maricopa County Internal Audit and as a Senior Editor also of Maricopa County. He has also worked for the Maricopa County Community College District as Senior Auditor. Scott served in the U.S. Coast Guard, and he is a certified fraud examiner. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Luigi. Thanks for having me.
All right, so as I mentioned earlier, we had a record turnout in the primary. We expect a record turnout in the general. There's a potential that Arizona might, in fact, decide the presidential race. A lot of folks, both on the Republican and the Democratic sides, strongly believe that Arizona is a battleground state. But first, let me ask Scott, how did the primary elections go from your perspective? What are the lessons learned from the August elections, but also from March when we really started implementing the voting center model?
So yeah, so for the August primary election, we had several different key objectives, especially considering that we were trying to host an election in the midst of COVID-19. And COVID-19 has been very disruptive to all of our lives and changed the way that we've done things. And elections, as we've observed across the country, have not been immune to some of these disruptions. So we set out with our objectives was to ensure that we could provide voters with safe voting options, allow voters to be able to choose the mode that they wanted to participate, whether that be voting early by mail, voting early in person, taking the early ballot that they received and dropping it off at any one of our vote centers or one of our drop boxes that we offered, to voting in person on election day. We also wanted to ensure that we were able to inform voters of how they could successfully participate in this election. We wanted to ensure that we were building trust in the election process. And then lastly, as you described in your question, is the lessons learned, and to take what we learned from March and August and build a model that would be able to serve voters in November in the era of COVID-19. So I'm very confident that we've been able to do that. As challenging as it has been to host elections in COVID-19, it's really given us a lot of information and detail and experiences that we can build upon. And I want to say that it was a successful election, and I'm confident in that because we did have historic turnout. We had over 860,000 voters vote and cast a ballot in this last election. Up over 160,000 more than have ever participated in August primary election before. And while at the same time implementing a new model, a vote center model that introduces flexibility and reliability into the process. So that model allowed us to serve in-person voters and keep wait times under 2 minutes on election day. And if voters chose to vote early, they didn't have to wait in line at all. And then we also, just over a year ago, the Board of Supervisors invested in new tabulation equipment. And in combination with a statute change or a law change that allowed us to start tabulating ballots 14 days earlier, and that new equipment, we were able to have 97% of our early ballots that we had received as of Sunday night reported in the election night returns. That helps build that confidence, right? And that's something that we've seen in jurisdictions and states across the country. Some of these early ballots, or as other states call them, absentee ballots, it's been taking those counties, several days, several weeks to count those ballots and get those results posted. And that can, cause some concern in the viability or reliability of those results from voters. Even though we know as election officials, there's very robust controls over those processes to ensure that the security of the ballot through the entire process is valid and that it's done with integrity. So I'm really confident in the procedures that we had established and some of the lessons learned. And some of those are making sure that we go ahead.
Let's dig into those in a little bit. I want to shift to, I want to ask Luis what he's seeing nationwide. And Luis, from your perspective, Scott said we've had a really successful election in the primary. I'm wondering if our experience is kind of replicated elsewhere in the country. What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think overall the primary in Arizona was really strong. In terms of the shift to the voting center model, one of the things I just kind of wanted to underscore, I think that the flexibility that it provides for voters certainly is great. And we've got some polling that we can talk about a little bit later that just sort of says that voters really like that flexibility of being able to vote in any location in the county as opposed to the precinct-based model. But it also means, there are some potential concerns and downsides that need to be considered whenever we are looking at that shift to the voting center model. So, it's a big shift for voters, obviously, particularly in a pandemic when lots of other things are changing for them. They're used to their neighborhood polling location. And so communication of those voters is super, super important to make sure that they understand the changes, they know where to go, they know what their options are. But then also, you're looking at a situation where there are, a significantly reduced number of polling locations for voters to go to. Scott can give you the exact number, but I know it was, upward of 500, I think, in 2016. And looking at now a large, certainly a larger voting centers, but down to, 170 or so. So that means that the criteria for actually selecting those sites becomes really, really important. And so, looking at things like proximity to voters who historically are disenfranchised or have low turnouts, communities that don't have heavy usage of the permanent early voting list, for example, proximity to public transportation, population centers, communities that have low household vehicle ownership, for example, individuals with disability and parking and traffic patterns. Those are all sort of considerations that need to be worked through in order to make that model successful. And I think that there's a lot of potential to do that. And maybe, I'll get into some of the national context as well, but I would also love to hear from Scott just in sort of in terms of some of the factors that were considered around, how the voting centers were selected and really what they were looking at in making those decisions.
In terms of the rest of the country,
Sure.
How many states have you seen that are also shifting or have adopted the vote center model?
Yeah, so there, there's a number of counties and states that are looking at it. I think one of the things that we're seeing in a number of places is the addition of, arena voting, for example, as one of those ways to provide early voting options in a really large location where voters can actually, spread out and socially distance. But it's certainly something that we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions consider. And in those conversations that we've had, we've been trying to emphasize the importance of really thinking and being thoughtful about where those specific places, those specific locations are actually placed and how they're serving the communities, especially if you're going from, a large number of voting locations down to a significantly smaller number of voting locations. Who is that actually serving and how are those decisions being made? So it is something that we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions consider. I think that, again, there are potentially some really strong advantages of it. The flexibility that it offers voters is certainly something that they like. Not being turned away from a precinct because you're at the wrong location. I think that's, definitely helpful for voters. But there's also, some other things that just have to be thought through as well.
Dr. Kelly, can you give us, let me back up. Of course, we're conducting the elections in the middle of a global pandemic. And this virus is very contagious. And, a great number of Americans have died, and a lot more have contracted COVID-19. So where are we, at least in our state, where are we, can you give us an update where we're at in terms of infection rates, for example?
Sure, Luigi. So the COVID-19 pandemic has hit our state particularly hard with over 200,000 cases so far and over 5,000 deaths thus far. And as a doctor, I know that this pandemic is far from over. There's just no doubt that the COVID-19 is going to fundamentally affect our society until a reliable vaccine is developed and administered widely. And, you know, all of this, of course, comes as our state and country gear up to put on an enormous general election that could see record turnouts. So many things are uncertain, but the one thing that is very clear to me is that we will be conducting this election in the midst of a pandemic. So it's very important for our leaders to continue to do everything they can to ensure that voters can cast their ballots safely this November.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Let's kind of go into the weeds, right? So, Scott, what were the biggest challenges that you saw with the voting center model, and I guess what's the plan to overcome them for November?
Yeah, so, and I also want to respond to some of Luis's questions about the strategies that we implemented to determine where those vote centers should be and how many vote centers.
Go ahead.
So when determining where we need to have a vote center, we are looking at many of those factors and pretty much every one that Luis had listed. So for the August primary, we had 99 vote centers that were available to voters. And that was down from the 500 that we had in the 2018 August primary. However, we expanded the number of check-in stations. So in the traditional precinct-based modeling, we usually only have 3 check-in stations per site. So in going to the 99 vote center model, we expanded that to be anywhere from 9 to 12 to 15 check-in stations. So they were serving as a 3 vote centers in our 3 polling locations in one, or up to 5 polling locations in one. But then we made sure that we had large enough locations that we could have physical distancing within to keep our poll workers safe, to keep those voters safe that wanted to have that in-person voting experience or needed to vote in person just because they did not receive their mail-in ballot, or because they have some language barriers that they need to visit a polling location. So it is important to provide those in-person voting options. But the significant challenges that we encountered was really informing voters of the change in the model and what that means for them and how to find a voting location. So we did update our website to provide a lot more searchability functionality, where their voters can, they type in their address, it shows them their closest open location, whether it's, then all the locations that are based on distance. But they could also search by city, they could search by, we added wait times because we wanted voters to be able to make informed decisions. So when they go to that website, locations.maricopa.vote, they can identify, okay, what is the wait time at this? I want to go to the location that's closest to me, or I could go to one maybe 2 or 3 miles that is further, but it also, but it has a shorter wait time. All of those types of decision-making factors, we put those in the hands of the voters. Now, there's, voters don't always have access to a computer, right? So we do also provide access through a phone number that they can call us to get that information. We inform local advocacy groups of those locations, getting that information out as soon as possible. And one of the challenges we had for June was we were trying to identify those locations as early as possible so we could get them on our website. And because we had a redesigned model, we had our traditional polling locations not available. And we're facing those same headwinds for the November general election.
So what you're saying is that, of course, choosing where the voting centers will be is really crucial. It's really critical, right? So what you're saying is that the challenge right now for you is figuring out where they're at and whether they're available, and what you can do to make them available, right?
That's correct. And also how large they can be So if we need to go to 15 check-in stations rather than just the 9, the standard model. So, and those are all the realities, the complexities of this model. I think Luis mentioned having, voters like to have that neighborhood voting location right next to them that they could go vote. And the realities are, in many cases, that location is no longer available. So, and if we went with that standard precinct-based model, that would mean that we would then end up putting that location combined with another location, and then you may have really challenges with physical distancing in those locations, and then potentially overloading one location, which we've seen at jurisdictions across the country. So that is the beauty of the vote center model, is it gives the voters the option to go to any one of those 99 locations, or for the November general, much more. And we're looking to expand to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 to 170 locations.
Dr. Kelly, so from about 500 precincts, we've narrowed that or shrunk that to about, hopefully we'll have 170 really great looking, voting centers in November, right? We want large venues that are really accessible, near to the roadways or highways. But that also means we have fewer locations, but are large ones. As somebody who's in the healthcare and is looking very closely at what potential risks a voter might have or a staffer might have, what do you see in terms of, what are your concerns when we approach the elections this way?
Okay, well, first of all, I am concerned that less people will be able to vote because, frankly, not everybody has a car. Not everybody has access to public transportation. And even if they do, public transportation these days is not, considered the safest place to be right now. And then
you're saying that because you're really in a confined space, right?
Right. And with,
a lot of people.
Who knows, 1,000 other people have touched the pole that you're holding onto or whatever, the seat you're sitting in. They, can't walk to many of these locations. It's just too far. Whereas in your precinct polling places, generally speaking, it's within walking distance of wherever a person lives. And, in the past, we knew where our voting location was in our precinct. It was the same every time. We knew where to go. I remember the first time that I went to my polling place in my precinct and there was nobody there. And I realized, oh, they've moved it. It took actually quite a bit of effort on my part the last several locations, because it was different every time, to figure out where am I supposed to go vote. And then once I did find out where to vote, actually finding that location within a mall area, without any real instructions other than a suite number. If I wasn't really persistent and really able to use the internet, I don't think I would have been able to find it or vote. So I think that when we limit voting options like that, in terms of like enabling the people who have internet and the people who have cars and have the time to be able to do, the searching for it and actually going to vote, which, can take some time when there's fewer polling places, I think it limits our ability to vote.
So let me go to Scott. Scott, how are you addressing specifically that, right? So, whereas before you kind of know where your precinct is. Well, in my case, by the way, my precincts, kind of has moved over the years. It used to be, this place and then another place. What the voting center model affords me is really, if I'm working downtown, then I can just look around and see where the voting center is and vote there, right? So that's the one thing that it affords me. But of course, in my situation, I do have a car and transportation is not a problem for me. How are you addressing these potential difficulties?
So in August, and we'll do the same approach for November, we had over 60% of our voting locations along major thoroughfares, freeways, those types of things, but also close to bus routes and bus stops and light rail routes. So we made a concerted effort to make sure that we had those locations along the public transportation corridors. We also, we recognize that was a challenge in some, like the the mall served a great voting location. That's where people are, especially even maybe in November when it is cooler, but right, not having the suite number. So now putting something along the lines of next to the food court in the actual name of the description. So that helps those voters that are using the website, but also adding additional signage. Like especially when the malls don't usually open till 11. So there are a few entrances in the mall that aren't open. So the closest one to the vote centers are open. So making sure we have that signage out front so voters know where to enter the different mall locations. So we recognize that that was some of the challenges. But really, it's informing the voters, getting them on our website as early as possible. We do send out a sample ballot to all voters before, usually it's right around 11 to 12 days before the election. We're going to actually mail it out a little bit sooner for this election because we do have a robust early voting period that we're offering voters. So that's another strategy that we're using to expand access to voters. We'll have 6 locations open 27 days before the election. We're going to have right around 50 locations nearly 2 weeks before the elections, much more than we've ever had in the past. Nearly 90 locations for 1 full week before the election. And then looking to those election day only sites, actually having them be 2-day sites and opening them up on Monday as well. So that just helps spread out the voters over a longer period of time. It allows those voters that maybe do have some transportation issues when they're doing errands on those, like on the weekends, or keeping those locations open till 5 or 7 p.m. allows them the opportunity to vote during that early voting period, not just on election day. So those are strategies that we're introducing to help serve those voters.
So I want to pause here for a second, and I want to ask our viewers and our listeners, do send in your questions. I'm seeing some of them, but if you have other questions that we haven't tackled yet, go ahead and ask us those questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible near the end of the program. Let me go to Luis. Luis, you commissioned a poll specifically in Arizona that, among other things, looked at voters' comfort level when voting in person, for example, and walk us through what are some of the key findings of this poll. And this, by the way, this poll was done by Mike Noble of OH Predictive Insights.
Yeah, absolutely. So the poll was conducted in early August and wrapped up about August 9th, I believe. And I think what was clear from it was really that there's a lot of potential in the voting center model. 71% of voters, for example, supported the idea of being able to vote at any location within a county. So that flexibility is something that really resonated with voters across the spectrum. We were looking at, numbers in the high 60s for Republicans and the mid 70s for Democrats. And so it's pretty common across the political spectrum that that's something that is valuable. But what we also saw, I think, was that voters, particularly in this time, were uneasy about voting in a voting center that served a lot of people. So 60% of voters, for example, said that they did not feel safe in that specific environment in those voting centers that served a lot of people, which I think really just underscores the need for as many locations as can possibly be found, right? I think there's a lot of potential in the voting center model. It seems like voters like that flexibility, but they're just a little worried right now, particularly in the COVID time, that there's going to be some congestion in the limited number of locations. And then I think when you look at sort of overall safety of how voters were feeling, all voters, again, across the political spectrum felt safest by voting through the early voting process by mail or returning their ballot by drop box, which 85% and 87% respectively felt safest doing that. And again, I think that speaks really to Arizona's kind of pioneer spirit on the vote by mail piece. You all have been doing it a while and have really instilled in voters a confidence in that sort of system. So we really saw that reflected. And then I think it also sort of underscored the importance of drop boxes too. And I know that's something that Maricopa County is looking at expanding, and some other counties are as well, but that can be a really important tool for voters who maybe don't feel comfortable putting their ballot in the mail, but want to instead go to a physical location and put it into a drop box so that they know exactly when it got there. So, maybe I think actually one of the, not to steal your thunder, Luigi, but one of the things I'd love to just kind of pose to Scott, you have obviously a very difficult job in conducting this election, and there's a lot of barriers that you all are facing in getting everything exactly right, and you're doing great. But I'm interested if you can maybe just shed a little bit of light for folks who are here today on some of the challenges that you all are facing in terms of finding those voting center locations and kind of the barriers, from in going from 170 locations to 250 or something like that.
Yeah, so there are several limiting factors. One is just providing a location that has the adequate size for physical distancing. So it's not just adding a location, right? You have to be able to make sure that you staff it with poll workers that are willing to work in a location. Just finding a location itself is not a success alone. So, and then making sure that you can keep those poll workers safe and then those voters safe through that process. So that's one limiting factor. And we really partnered with the county public health department to design the safest voting model for in-person voting as possible, given the constraints of the COVID-19. So that's one limitation. The other limitation too is expanding up to 250 or more than the 170 in a vote center model is we need to be able to produce the ballots themselves. So in Maricopa County, we have over 3,000 different ballots. So if we were to start expanding beyond the 170, which we recognize that if we were going to have to go to a vote center model, we like the vote center model because it does provide all the flexibility in case there were cancellations late in the process, like we've seen in other states. What we learned in March, where we had to redesign the entire election in 5 days, going from 229 locations down to 148, is being able to produce those ballots. So we need ballot on demand technology, printers to produce those. And there was a supply chain issue, right? Getting those printers in time for this election. So that gives us, we procured enough, started that process early on in June, that we were able to get to right around just over 170 locations as possible. But then it's contacting the facilities themselves. All of those traditional polling locations that we've used, schools right now, if they're going to be in session, many of them don't have that space available to us anymore. You would think that the high school gym's the perfect location, cafeteria. Well, they're using that to physical distance and provide in-person learning options to several of their students. So that location, they're not willing to provide a polling location for us. So then being able, what's the next best option, the closest option to those voters? And so the model that we are using is trying to identify locations every about 3 miles or 3 to 4 miles in between each location. That would mean that most voters are 1.5 to 2 miles away from a voting location. And then also making sure that they are on those public transportation corridors so it's easy to access those locations. Or they're in venues that voters are familiar with, going to a mall. Now, I agree that we've already discussed this, that we can refine that messaging of how to find the location in the mall better and adding additional signage. And those are some of the things that we'll take away and implement for November.
When you mentioned that part of the challenge is just making sure that if a person walks in and that person is from a precinct or a district that then has like unique features on his ballot, right? Maybe a particular race that it's not available, in other parts of the valley, that you're able to print that ballot for that person, and that person can then vote.
So that's correct. So we have 3,000 different ballot styles within Maricopa County. So being able to produce that person's actual ballot, so then that can be cast and they're not having to vote a provisional ballot. And that's one of the real drawbacks to the precinct-based model, especially in an era of COVID-19, is if we were forced to have to close a location, especially at the last minute, that meant that we're combining locations. So maybe, and they may be even smaller locations that didn't allow for physical distancing. And then you're adding more ballot styles to have to disseminate within a polling location. So then that's another bottleneck within the polling location, meaning that voters would have to stand in line that much longer to get their ballot, as the poll workers had to identify which ballot to hand out. The ballot on demand technology, combined with the site book check-in stations that we have, the voters go through the process. It takes right around 2 minutes for a voter to check in on our site book stations. And then that printer prints their actual ballot. And we control that process through a control slip that puts the voter's name on it. What is that ballot that they're getting? We expand the number of voting booths. All the voting booths are 6 feet apart from each other. So it really is designed to get voters through the process as quickly as possible, not having those bottlenecks and not running the risk of then at the last minute having to force all those voters into 1 or 2 precincts that from the strategy, if we had gone with that precinct-based model, they would not have potentially been large enough to be able to accommodate those voters.
So let me ask Dr. Kelly, the trend lines show that Arizona's cases are going down, right? So that's been the trend for the last couple of weeks, but you did mention that, this virus is not going away anytime soon. And we're hoping for a vaccine. We're conducting clinical trials at this point for those vaccines. Hopefully they're made available, or we can, they succeed and they're available like soon, but they may not be available soon. So we have to kind of live with the idea that this virus is going to be with us for a little bit, or maybe even for a longer term.
Yeah, I don't believe we'll have a vaccine before the election.
Yeah, exactly. So as an individual, like, can you provide us some tips on how we can minimize the risk when we all vote in November?
Well, first of all, as individuals, we can take care of our own personal protective equipment. And I see that somebody on the chat asked if masks were going to be required at polling places, and they're required for the whole county. So any polling place within the county, yes, you are required to wear a mask. Certainly the people who work at the polling places will be wearing a mask. Whether you wear eye protection or not, I think it's a good idea. I wear it. I wear a face shield. Your options are a face shield or goggles. The goggles need to have, a tight seal around your eyes, so glasses not good. You may opt to wear gloves if you wish, and gloves have their pros and cons. So some people kind of forget they're wearing the gloves, so they touch their face, with the potentially contaminated gloves, or touch their eyes or their mouth or their nose. And so obviously that defeats the purpose of gloves. But if you're only wearing them for a short period, let's just say at the polling place or at the grocery store, you're more aware that you're wearing the gloves, so you're more likely to be aware of your hands and more aware where you put your hands. So, I think there is some benefit to wearing gloves for a lot of people for certain situations. I actually wear them in certain situations, and I carry hand sanitizer with me, and I even put hand sanitizer on the gloves. So I think, most of all, wearing a mask is the most important thing, but we do now think that we can catch it through our eyes from aerosol transmission. So eye covering is a good idea too.
I'm sorry, you mentioned in addition to wearing a mask, a face mask, you're also
absolutely that's required. That's the law.
That in addition to that, you're also recommending that people wear a face shield if they're able.
If they can, they're widely available now, and so.
Or eye goggles that are really fit, right?
Yeah, those are a little less available, but the masks or the face shields are inexpensive. They're like $1 each or so, and they're available. If people want to go ahead and add an additional layer of protection, they can do that. And obviously it's not required, but masks are required.
Right, so I want to make a finer point on that one, right? So cities have, major cities have required masks. So if you're in public, you're under a requirement to wear a mask. And so I guess my question, Scott, is that let's say somebody shows up at the polling center, is not wearing a mask. What happens?
So we have purchased enough masks to be able to offer. And so we strongly encourage voters to wear a mask, but we cannot require a voter to wear a mask when voting in a voting location. Voting is a constitutional right. So we can encourage, we can even provide the mask, which we will have in the voting locations if they show up. But if they refuse to wear a mask, we cannot turn a voter away from the voting process. We will allow them to vote, but we will immediately afterwards wipe down all the surfaces that that voter touched. So any other voter that's entering the voting location can still feel confident and safe that to enter that location. Every one of our poll workers will be wearing a mask. We've purchased face shields for our poll workers to wear. We are offering, well, all of our poll workers will be wearing gloves, but we're offering that to voters as well, as Dr. Kelly indicated. Those voters will put on those gloves. They'll go through the process. They'll check in. They'll go get their ballot. They'll get a pen that has just been sanitized, right? So they get their own pen. They go through and they vote that process. They take that pen to either the drop box if it's in an early voting location, or a precinct-based tabulator if it's on election day. And then they drop that pen in the bucket. Our poll workers then sanitize those pens and then take them back to the beginning of the process. So, and we've done all of these safety protocols in addition with physical distancing, really designed them based on Center for Disease Control guidelines, and then really working with the county's Department of Public Health to identify what is practical and what is the best way to keep voters safe during this process.
Let me ask you, I'm sorry, Dr. Kelly,
Yeah, I noticed a question came in about if masks are mandated in Maricopa County, why are they not required at the polls? And I'm kind of curious about that too. I mean, we do have a legal mandate to wear a mask. Why are they not required at the polls?
So the constitutional right sort of trumps all of those local ordinances. And it could be viewed as a poll tax. Voters can't afford the masks themselves. Even though we're offering them, we cannot not require a mask to vote. And there's all sorts of exceptions within those local ordinances based on age, based on the own health risks of some of the individuals that have those masks. So we cannot enforce that to vote. Now we can strongly encourage, which we are doing. We would prefer voters to wear a mask, and then we can offer them. But if they do refuse, we will let them vote. We'll get them through the process as quickly as possible. And then we've established the other protocols, the frequently wiping down of high touch surfaces, the door handles, the check-in stations, the voting booths, all of those to keep the voting location as safe as possible.
So when I voted in August, I did see that everybody who walked into the voting center had worn a mask, and but there's always the possibility, right, that somebody may just refuse to do so. Luis, let me ask you about poll worker recruitment. What are you seeing in terms of, not just Arizona's, but the rest of the country's ability to recruit poll workers? Typically, our poll workers are in the higher age bracket because they have the time, and this is, for many of them, this is a tradition. Every 2 years, they go and volunteer or be a poll worker.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a major concern for election administrators that we're talking to across the country. And we've seen some examples from primaries of poll workers, backing out very last minute, and that creating some disruptions. Maybe they were sick, maybe they just don't show up. So we've also seen a number of really innovative solutions, I think, from states and counties across the country to really try to incentivize serving as a poll worker as much as they can. So some of the things that we're seeing, for example, counties in Georgia and Iowa and states like Alabama and Kansas are increasing the poll worker pay significantly to try to incentivize folks to serve. They're also creating incentives for state and county workers to serve as poll workers. So if you look at a state like Alaska, for example, is allowing state employees to serve as poll workers at full pay for rather than serve as their day-to-day job. So that's one of the solutions that we've seen. Illinois is making Election Day a state holiday, so all state employees have that day off and can serve as a poll worker. Oklahoma, for example, is giving state employees up to 3 days of paid leave to serve as poll workers, which is another way to kind of incentivize those employees in particular to serve. And then expanding eligibility for who can serve as poll workers. We've seen some limitations in places about who can actually serve as a poll worker in a particular place. So looking at, expanding whether or not the person has to live in that county, for example, or some states that have even started to reduce the age and looking at, individuals who are 16 and 17 and serving as poll workers. And then another piece is really through partnerships. So Alaska, for example, is allowing nonprofits in the state to actually adopt a precinct and really focus on poll worker recruitment for that particular precinct. Wisconsin utilized, I think, 2,400 plainclothed National Guard members to serve as poll workers. And then when you look at a state like Nebraska, they really partnered with associations like the Bar Association, the Realtors Association to find those workers. And then also we're actually getting support from some of those state nonprofits to provide, advertisement, pro bono for radio ads and those kinds of things as well.
Thank you, Louis. So Scott, in your experience in the August primary, how successful were you in recruiting poll workers, and what do you anticipate to see, potential challenges you see for November?
So, well, one of the strategies right away is the fact that we had 99 locations versus 500. We did increase the number of poll workers per location to overcome any potential absenteeism, those types of things. But that just reduces the number. So for this vote center model, we'll need about 1,800 poll workers versus 3,600. So that is one strategy that we're using to overcome the need to hire poll workers and recruit those. But as some of the strategies that Luis mentioned, the state of Arizona is providing full pay for service to work as a poll worker. So, and we're getting a pipeline, number of state employees that want to work for us. Same with the county here in Maricopa County. We provide full pay, and then they can also come and work as a poll worker. So we have, and yesterday was National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, and our email boxes were filling with people very interested in working this election. And I think the real number one strategy, though, is can we implement a safe in-person voting experience, right? We surveyed after the March presidential preference election. We went and surveyed every one of our poll workers and asked them if they were willing to work in August and November. And the overwhelming response was yes, as long as you can keep us safe. And keeping them safe is ensuring that we have physical distancing in the polling locations, making sure that we have the PPE that's needed, which we do. We've already been able to purchase all of that for this vote center model, and making sure that we have the cleaning supplies and the solution and those types of things to wipe down all those frequently touched surfaces.
So how much, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but how much are you going to earn? How much are you going to get if you if you get hired as a poll worker?
So anywhere from $13 to $15 an hour is what you get paid, depending on the specific role, and you can do that for. We will have some sites that will be open just one day, but the vast majority will be open at least 2 days or more. And so now, which is something new, especially those sites that are 1 week or 2 weeks, there's even some overtime opportunities there for poll workers to earn a little bit more money through this process as well. So, but yeah, anywhere from $13 to $15 an hour.
So I think there's so many questions that our viewers have asked, and so let's try and get to as many of them as we can. Let me see here. So here's a question from Danette. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Our college campus has been a polling place in the past. That's the Red Mountain Mesa Community College, and we would like to continue to serve in this capacity. We would also like to serve as an advocacy group to help inform voters. how can we be recognized as this, and is there going to be training? I think that's a question for Scott.
Yeah, so the Mesa Red Mountain campus served as a polling location for August, and we are planning to use them again for the upcoming November, and we're really grateful. Pretty much most of the community colleges throughout the county are serving as polling locations, so it's really a great partnership. They offer, again, they have lots of different options, large locations for us to, and then they're geographically dispersed in so many different locations throughout the valley. So
here's another question from Steve, and I think a lot of these questions are directed to you, Scott, and I think the reason is obvious, right? You're running our elections, and so in Maricopa County. And so here's one from Steve Bartley. Are you seeing a good voter response to the extended hours and days that some of the voting centers are open to do in-person voting?
absolutely, and I actually took some stats down, so I don't have them memorized off the top of my head. But so for the August primary early voting in 2008, we had just over 4,000 voters vote early in person. In 2020, we had close to 12,000. That was 2.7 times the amount. So 270% increase over 2018. So we did see that voters were very responsive to that early voting process. We expect that that's going to only increase for November, because not only will it be much cooler, right, and people might be out and be willing to, right, if you recall, the last 2 weeks, and we're still sort of encountering it right now, but the last 2 weeks of July, the first week of August, we're going through a record heat wave here in Phoenix and Maricopa County, which probably had some effect on whether voters wanted to venture out. But we also, by expanding weekend and evening hours. So in weekend in 2018, we had a total of 343 voters vote on the weekend in 2018, where we had over 5,000 voters vote in the weekend for the August 2020 primary. So we are seeing a significant increase in voters wanting to take advantage of that early voting period.
So here's a question from Patty. If there's a potential risk or if people are not comfortable going to voting center, and Patty doesn't want to go to a large voting center, I think for the reasons that we've discussed, what are the options for her?
So, well, and you mentioned me sort of managing or running elections in Maricopa County. And there's actually, I have a co-director, Mr. Ray Valenzuela, who is my counterpart, reports up to the recorder, and he manages the early voting period. And we work in collaboration to make sure that we're serving voters in Maricopa County. But I'm going to actually steal a comment that he says. And he says that it's not voting by mail, it's getting your ballot by mail. And then getting your ballot by mail gives voters a lot of different options. So they can take their ballot by mail, and their new polling place becomes their couch, right, at home. They can use that ballot, they can vote or vote it and return it by mail. But they can then also take that ballot and return it to any one of our drop boxes. So we're partnering with cities and towns to make sure that we have secure drop boxes in polling locations. We're also looking to make sure that we can implement some contactless or drive-through drop box locations throughout the valley. And we're looking with various different partners to be able to do that. Voters can take that early ballot and bring it to any one of our vote centers. So the fact that we'll have that robust early voting period, they can drop that ballot off at any one of those locations during that early voting period.
Yeah, I want to ask Luis a follow-up question, because the Dropbox approach seems very convenient, right? So you can, and just to be clear, if it's inside a city hall, for example, you do have to go personally, in person, go inside a building and then drop off your ballot. But Luis, the idea of drop boxes, are you seeing this elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, drop boxes are very common, are widely used in a number of places, and really offer voters the opportunity to, as Scott mentioned, another option to cast their ballot if they're receiving their ballot by mail. So it's a very common thing, and I've seen lots of questions in here about drop boxes specifically. And really they're safe, they're secure, they're widely used. I'm based in Denver, and we're an entirely vote by mail state, but I always take my ballot and I go to the drop box and I drop it off, and that's how I choose to vote. And there really are very little issues with it. I would actually, maybe Scott, if you could just kind of shine some light on the criteria around Dropbox placement as well. Are they inside buildings or secured to the ground, et cetera? I'd be interested to know what sort of things you all are looking at.
Yeah, through the Secretary of State's Elections Procedures Manual or the Arizona Elections Procedures Manual, that's where drop boxes are governed and all the security protocols. And you can have a drop box as long as it is secured to the ground or within a government facility. The other option that is available is if it's manned. So if we do have a drive-through drop box, we can have election officials, so staff members similar to poll workers that we trained. We'll have bipartisan poll workers working those locations. And then as voters would then drive up in their car, they could just hand their ballot to those poll workers who then insert it into the drop box itself. So, and then the strategy that we're looking is just making sure that we have enough of those located throughout the valley, and are really looking, with various different partners to make sure that we can do that. And then have enough of them open. Some of them open through that early voting period and definitely on some of the weekends before. And then right through that last weekend, we know that voters tend to be procrastinators, right, in this society. I think all of us sort of have those tendencies. So having as many of those locations open right up to the election as possible to provide those voters that option.
Dr. Kelly, I think this is a question for you. This one's from Lena. Face shields are great, but people think they can use them instead of masks. Can you answer this one?
No, absolutely not. Face shields are an adjunct or an addition to a mask to protect your eyes. They do not protect your mouth and nose. So you have to still use a mask along with a face shield.
Here's a question from, here's another question. Are the mail-in envelopes identified by party in any way with an R or D, for example, Scott?
So during the primary, because that is a partisan election, and we do need to, when we go through our EV processing, we have to actually identify that the ballot, because can have spousal swaps, right? Some members of a household might be a Democrat or Republican. We need to make sure that those ballots are in the same, are in the correct envelope. But in the November general election, no, there's no identifier on the actual affidavit envelope that's returned, because everyone's getting the same ballot, the general election ballot.
We have a couple of questions about a voter who comes into a voting center who's not wearing a mask. And I think you laid out earlier your argument that this is a constitutional right, and that trumps ordinances, for example, by city officials. But here's a question from Alex, and he says the Secretary of State has stated voters refusing to wear a mask should be offered curbside voting. Is this an option for the county?
We do offer curbside voting in Maricopa County. However, we do not have the resources to be able to say every voter that doesn't want to wear a mask can visit one of our polling locations and vote curbside. That just pulls all those poll workers away. And then just the parking lots, we don't have enough parking lots for all those different locations for curbside voting. So our strategies is to encourage every voter to wear a mask, and then provide our poll workers with the safety equipment and the PPE to keep them safe, even if there were a voter that did refuse to wear a mask, but then to immediately wipe down all of those surfaces that they touched, so it would be then safe for the next voter to use.
Here's a question from Sandy. I think it's a related question. And she says, you have to allow people to vote, but you don't have to allow people into the polling place without a mask. Is that an option as well? I guess it's really the same question, right? It's, I think Sandy's point here is that will you be putting poll workers at risk if you allow a person to vote without a mask inside the voting center?
and how we're overcoming that again is providing the poll workers themselves with the safety equipment, the masks, the face shield, the gloves, all of those types of items, and the frequently cleaning of surface. So, and again, it's our strategy to get that voter who refuses to wear a mask through the process as quickly as possible.
Let me see. Here's a well, it's just really a comment. I was a poll worker for the primary. The voting center ran very smoothly. We had more than enough people to staff it, and voters seemed to love it. We never had a backed up, even on election day. I did see a question about whether you mentioned that you're cutting down the number of poll workers, or there won't be the need for as many poll workers as we had in the past. I think you mentioned from 3,600 to 1,800. Are you tied to that number, or are you flexible? Or is that pretty much, based on everything you've seen, that's all we need, and it's 1,800 poll workers?
So one of the things that we've learned, and we're definitely anticipating a lot more turnout for November than we had in August. So some of those locations that we do have 12 check-in stations, 15 check-in stations, we will need to expand the number of poll workers working at those. Our base model was 9 check-in stations, 3 ballot on demand printers, about 20 voting booths. And we're confident that there are 10 poll workers can serve that model. But when we expand up to 12 or to even 15 check-in stations, we do need a couple additional poll workers. So that's where we're getting right around the 1,800 that we'll need for this election.
And I think we're pretty much out of time, but I do want to ask Luis, I guess the question is that, what is your hope for the general election? And based on what you're seeing from elsewhere in the country, what is the one, I suppose, big idea, if you want to call it a big idea, that maybe Arizona can adopt, that something that we're not doing yet?
Sure. I think that one of the things I actually want to underscore, we focused a lot on Maricopa County because obviously we've got Scott on, but the plans are really kind of different across various counties in Arizona. For example, Pinal County is not shifting to a voting center model, and they're really as close to business as usual as you could expect a county to do. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that, it's sort of different depending on the location. I think really, the biggest thing is that this election is going to be kind of all hands on deck, right? We're going to need poll workers and the community to really come together to make sure that this happens adequately. So, if you're a business owner, for example, and you can give your employees the day off to go serve as a poll worker, or there's another way for you to help sort of contribute to where things are and how this election is run, then I would definitely encourage that. But I think, Scott and his team and everyone who's doing election administration in Arizona and across the country have really tough jobs. And I think it's really going to be kind of a community effort to make sure that voters are educated, they know where to go, they're turning out. We have poll workers, the locations are communicated. So I think I would just sort of underscore that point that this is really going to take everyone.
Dr. Kelly, I want to ask you, ma'am, we have an array of options for voters. What for you is the best one?
Which is the best, in my opinion?
Yeah.
To get an early ballot and either to mail it or to drop it off, which is a quick process. You don't have to, well, I've never had to stand in line to drop my ballot off. Ideally people would have a location close to them that's easy to find. I didn't find that to be true in August, but hopefully that they've made some improvements on that. And so it's going to be a tough job to conduct this election safely, but I do feel confident that the officials and Scott, all you and your team are doing everything you can to address these issues so that we can all vote and all vote safely.
And Scott, what do you call this? What do you need to do this week as you prepare for November? Just give us an idea what your, what the strategies are that are being adopted, perhaps, or modified this week.
So this week we're still trying to identify as many locations as possible. Right now we have just over 140 confirmed. So we need, and we're working with really about 25 other locations that do look very promising, but there's still a handful more that we do need to add, that we do have some gaps. So that's part.
And just real quick before you before you end that answer, for folks who have large locations or who have seen large locations, how can they let your office know that this facility exists or that it might be available?
So yeah, so they could call. We do have our STAR call center, so 602-506-1511. So that's a number, and if they just ask for any of our facility acquisition manager or their team to get in touch with, and then they can provide that information that way. I think that'd be the best way. But other things that we're working on this week is assigning our poll workers to all of those locations so that we have, and recruiting more poll workers. We are refining our communication strategies on how we're going to be communicating with voters, improving our paid media campaign. We have a communications team that is doing lots of earned media. So if you're watching the news, you'll see them out there conducting those interviews to get those poll workers and voters informed of how they can help volunteer or participate in this process. We're doing ballot proofing, right? Looking at the ballot, making sure that it's easy to read, to understand, that doing all of our reconciliations for the ballot. So there's a lot of work to do this week and every week leading up into the election, but I'm absolutely confident in our staff, and I think the voters should be looking forward to a very successful election in November.
And with that, Scott, Dr. Kelly, Luis, thank you again for joining our morning scoop this morning, and you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And to our viewers and our listeners, I'll see you around.